How useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into the Stakhanovite movement? Explain your answer using sources B and C and your knowledge of the historical context. 8 marks. Here's the mark scheme for this question, which you can find out about in more detail in the overview video. But we do know that all 8 marks here are awarded for AO3, and that's your analysis and evaluation of source utility. All that means really is you making a judgment on how useful this source is to the inquiry that you've been given in the question. In order to make that judgment, you might focus on one of these things, so how accurate it might be, how reliable you think it is, any limitations, so things that it doesn't include or isn't really that helpful for, knowledge of the author which is given to you above the source, or valuable information offered by the source. If you can focus on maybe 1 or 2 of these to decide how useful the source is for your inquiry, it's a really easy way to score highly in AO3. That means that rather than just making an assertion, so saying this source is useful, you need to reason, you need to use one of these factors above to decide how useful the source is. You'll also be thinking about the content, so what the source actually says. You'll be thinking about the context, so what you know about when it was written or what it's written about. And provenance, so who wrote it, when did they write it, why did they write it, and so on. So just try and keep those things in mind. You don't have to talk about everything, but just try and keep them in mind to make sure that your answer is really nicely focused on utility. It's also important to remember that the question isn't asking you to compare source B and source C. In fact, you could actually talk about them separately. You've got to think about why B is useful and why C is useful, not if one is more useful than the other. Here are the bands for this question. Now you can see in order to score in the highest band, you need to show developed reasoning. So maybe you've used one of the factors that we listed above to make a judgment on how useful the source is and really clearly explain your thinking. You've also considered the provenance, so where the source came from, and how that might impact how useful the source is. You could also draw in some contextual knowledge, so stuff that you already know about the topic, to help you to interpret the source and make that judgment. Essentially, this question is all about stating how useful you think the source is, using the information given to you in the source and before it, and the information that you already have about the topic, to explain why you made that judgment. Showing that you can do this well is how you can score in the highest band. There are many points you could make here, so as long as what you say is relevant and correct, the examiner should award you a mark for it. But let's take a look at some points you might have included. Now you might notice that the mark scheme is separated into utility of the content of the source, utility of the provenance and purpose, and utility of the source in relation to its historical context. So if you can make sure that you're hitting all 3 of those headings, that's a great way to show the examiner that you've thought really carefully about the question and also to write nicely developed points. So let's look at an example for source B. Now in terms of the content of the source, so what it actually says, it suggests that Stalin strongly encouraged the Stakhanovite movement. Now, if you want to think about the provenance and purpose of the source, you might note that as a propaganda poster, it was produced to encourage productivity, which is an ideal, it's an objective, rather than offering a realistic depiction of industrialisation and the role that Stakhanovite workers played. Then to bring in historical context, so this is your opportunity to show the examiner what you already know. You might say that rapid industrialisation was very important for improving the Soviet Union's economy. So Stalin utilised Stakhanov as a model to encourage workers to be as productive as possible. Now, if you can find a way to weave together those 3 points, it's a really, really good and really nicely developed point, and hopefully that would score you in the top bands. So do take a look at the rest of the points for source B and source C to see if there's anything you could have added to your answer.